Hello, and welcome to the Boston Globe's webinar, Boston's Booming Biotech Ecosystem. I'm Yvonne Greenstreet, CEO of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and I'm proud to kick off this important discussion on the state of the biotech sector in the Boston area and its rapidly evolving nature. You'll hear from some renowned voices: Robert Buderi, the founder of Exconomy, Ruth Lehman, director of the Whitehead Institute, and John Maraganore, Alnylam's former and founding CEO and my close colleague for many years. When I first came to Alnylam in 2016 after stints at GSK and Pfizer, I did so not only to be part of an industry-leading company in Alnylam, but also to be part of the vibrant, innovation-driven biotech ecosystem that exists here and which has no equal anywhere in the world. And Alnylam is very much a product of this ecosystem, with the earliest research into our technology being done by our founders at MIT, and then later, the IP being licensed from MIT and UMass, as well as the Max Planck Institute. Being based in the heart of Kendall Square, surrounded by innovative peers, a vast pool of biotech talent, world-class hospitals, and the local venture community has certainly played an integral role in Alnylam's 20-plus year journey and our success. Alnylam started as a small, ambitious startup, seeking to take on some of the world's most challenging issues faced in medicine. We saw immense promise for translating the breakthrough discovery of RNA interference, RNAi, into an entirely new class of innovative medicines with the potential to transform people's lives. To deliver on that promise, it was important to our founders and early leaders that we stay here in Massachusetts, rooted in Kendall Square. You simply can't discuss our booming ecosystem without acknowledging how it's transformed since its early days. Biogen, Genzyme, and a handful of others paved the way and established the biotech model that inspired Alnylam's founders and so many others to try to take their science beyond the bench to the patient's bedside. This history allows us to reflect on where the ecosystem is today, the challenges it faces, and what's possible tomorrow. While none of us has a crystal ball, I'm personally very excited about what the future holds for biotech innovation and ultimately the incredibly positive impact that our industry and our region will have for patients. With that, we hope you enjoy the discussion, and now I'll turn it over to Boston Globe's biotech writer, Ryan Cross, to kick off the panel.
Hello, and thank you for joining today's event on Boston's booming biotech ecosystem. I'm Ryan Cross, a biotech writer for the Boston Globe. I'm pleased to introduce our three distinguished guests. First up is Dr. John M. Maraganore. John is a longtime leader in Boston's biotech industry, most recently having served as the founding CEO of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals for 19 years, where he led the development of the first approved drugs based on RNA interference technology. Today, he serves on the board of several Boston biotech companies, works with multiple venture capital firms and several other companies. Next up is Dr. Ruth Lehman. Ruth is the director of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research and a professor of biology at MIT. She was previously a member of the Whitehead from 1988 to 96 before moving her lab to NYU, where her research on germ cells earned her international renown. Ruth is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and was recognized with the Gruber Prize in Genetics last year. She's been back in Boston since 2020 to lead the Whitehead, a powerhouse of fundamental biology research. And finally, Robert Buderi. Bob is an author, journalist, and entrepreneur. He is a former editor-in-chief of the magazine MIT Technology Review and founder of the digital media company Exconomy, which was a major source for biotech industry news for over a decade. Bob is also the author of several books, including his most recent work, Where Futures Converge, Kendall Square, and the Making of a Global Innovation Hub. Thank you all for being here. We're going to kick off the discussion today by looking back at how Boston became a biotech town. There are so many biotech startups here, world-renowned life science research institutions and venture capital firms. It's almost hard to imagine it wasn't always this way. But I understand that Kendall Square wasn't exactly always the hotbed for biotech that it is today. So to kick things off, how did we get here?
Bob, you wrote the book.
Yeah.
wrote a book about that. I mean, basically, the evolution goes back to the 50s and 60s when Harvard recruited James Watson, and MIT recruited Salvador Luria to build up molecular biology. They attracted an amazing core of top scientists, many who've won many prizes, including the Nobel, and names that we recognize: Mark Potashny, Tom Maniotis at Harvard, Phil Sharp, and many others at MIT. So that was the nucleus, I'll stop there for that, and it led to the first companies in the 80s.
But one thing that was really important in the origin of Kendall Square was the unfortunate assassination of John F. Kennedy, because that led, originally Kendall Square was going to be the home of the Space Center, and it would have been, Cambridge, we have a problem, not Houston. But in fact, Lyndon Johnson, not surprisingly, wanted to move the Space Center to Texas, where he was from. So that decision, or that event, really left an open space right next door to MIT, right down the street from Harvard, right across the street across the river from the medical schools. And that really was an important part of just the access to space that was obviously really critical in the biogenesis of Kendall Square.
And I kind of always see it from the academic side, that also the proximity to MIT, and MIT being an engineering school. And so the idea of entrepreneurs was very common to the engineers. And that kind of, I think, really influenced the biologists to think like, oh, we could do this too. And so really encouraged them, and maybe at the time took away some of the sort of questioning, oh, you're not going to sell yourself or whatever. Then there was sort of a limitation of not thinking that we can actually really take our discoveries and translate them into products which can really benefit human health. So I think it's kind of a really interesting combination: space, academic, all these academic centers, and sort of the support of doing actually this kind of entrepreneurship.
And we shouldn't forget the competitive spirit of Boston. Beat LA, right? And it was in the late 70s that Genentech was founded and capitalized, and there was a lot of interest from the local academic community to find a rival type company. And you had Genetics Institute and Biogen beginning around that time. And most of the entrepreneurs initially came out of Chicago, came out of Abbott and Baxter, and they were the ones that came to this town initially as general managers, experienced people, and so forth, that led the early wave of biotechnology in this town, supported by venture capitalists that happened to be here at the same time.
You reminded me of this story Phil Sharp told me when he was approached to form a biotech company that became Biogen, he and Wally Gilbert. And the idea was that there would be Genentech on the West Coast, and there would be one company on the East Coast. And that was the one they were trying to form. And that was going to be it. And of course, it didn't work out that way.
It seems like there's always, I think even today, right, there's a bit of a rivalry, if you will, between the West Coast and New England in terms of, who is really the center, the epicenter for biotech. And it seems like that's kind of always been there since the beginning. How big of a role do you think that played? Maybe the sort of cultural differences and the differences between the kinds of academic institutions that were in, say, the Bay Area versus Boston?
mean,
Well,
one difference is
yeah, Ruth, you said,
yeah, one difference is clearly there's a lot of medical schools and a lot of hospitals in Boston, and it's all in a very small space. So you don't have to, cross too many bridges, and so I think just the accumulation, and this is patients, right? Problems, physician scientists, and so I think that is a big difference. Just a mere numbers of where the questions are coming from.
and the concentration that Ruth alluded to is just something you don't see, up and down the, in the Bay Area, you can go up and down the peninsula before you run into a medical center or university. And here it's just, you're just down the street. And that's very, very different. The real concentration of, at least at the beginning, and of course now it's spread out a lot, but at the way beginning, that concentration was really quite important.
I think obviously not every academic scientist has ambitions to be an entrepreneur, but many of them do in this city. And I'm wondering if there are certain things that you think may have catalyzed that shift from maybe this older stigma of an academic scientist getting involved and translating an idea into a company. What caused people to be more open to that?
I know, shall I go ahead? I mean, I would say, I'm really curious what you guys are thinking, but I would say it's possible, right? So we know so much more. I mean, in the 80s, right? Let's say, the first genes get identified. Yeah, you can speculate, oh, we may know this or that, right? But then came the Genome Project. And so all of a sudden we knew all the genes, and all of a sudden it does become, for a scientist who's always trained to be critical and try to, make their conclusions based on facts. You don't like to just sort of totally think into the blue and promise something which you can't fulfill. And I think that is just so clear now that you can. And there actually, I would even go as far as saying that the border between a truly academic lab at a university and what's going on biotech is getting more and more not so clear, right? And so I think it's just it's a revolution in science that has happened, right?
I have a question, Ruth. You may have a great insight on this. It was like 2009 or 10, that recently, I went to a seminar at MIT where they were trying to convince all the postdocs and PhD students that it was okay to go into business. And even then, I mean, they trotted out Bob Langer talking about how many companies, all these things. Even then, it seems so obvious today. But do you see just a total change in students?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's obviously the success on the one hand. Now it's almost the opposite. Now I think really academia has to do a good job to say there is actually reasons, and you do need academic institutions because you want to train people, and there are questions which are not applicable yet. And there are, discoveries which still have to be made, which are not translatable yet because the discoveries have to be made first, right? And so I think we're almost in the opposite. Certainly, when I look around and talk to the new incoming graduate students, right, many of them will say now, my goal is to go into biotech. That was not the case, certainly 20 years ago, and probably even 10 years ago. So there's a big shift, and I think it's a really interesting shift because I think academic science is really now part of the ecosystem. So we're part of the. I see it really. There's a very strong connection, and we need to actually realize that and how fluid the interactions are.
I mean, going back to the 70s, it was the Bayh-Dole Act piece of legislation that enabled NIH-sponsored research to be licensed to private sector companies. And that was a critical part of the beginning of the biotechnology industry, because otherwise, the beginnings of these companies really traditionally have come out of academic research and typically filed with patents. And MIT in particular, locally, played a really critical role there. And the technology licensing office, the leadership of Lita Nelson, who used to run that office for many, many years, was just fundamentally critical for the biogenesis of the industry, and especially in the Boston area. That piece of legislation really made it possible for this to happen at the end of the day.
That's a really good point, John. And you know, they actually at MIT, Ed Roberts kind of led it. They recruited the Stanford head of Office of Technology License to show MIT how to get with the modern world. And then as part of the transition in that, Lita Nelson was recruited not as head initially, but she would only come if they gave her this new field of biotech.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're hitting on something really important here, which is that when we talk about the biotech ecosystem, right, it doesn't just mean biotech companies. It truly is this ecosystem that includes those companies, the investors, but also the academic institutions. I'm wondering what you all think about, you know, how important that academic research is to the origins of what biotech companies are working on. Because companies, you know, over the decades relied more and more on academic research as a starting point for their drugs, or have they maybe went the other way and started doing more things themselves, or maybe it's a bit of both?
Well, I can tell you from an Alnylam perspective, we started based on academic research. Yvonne, in her opening comments, referred to it, but it was work done out of MIT and the Whitehead Institute and University of Massachusetts, and then the Max Planck Institute that, you know, was what we relied on early on, and the IP that came from that work that was filed by those universities that we licensed in. None of this would have happened for Alnylam had it not been for, you know, the brilliance of those academic researchers at the beginning to make a discovery that we thought could be useful from a new medicines perspective. And that wasn't particularly different than what happened at Biogen, where I spent 10 years earlier in my life and career, and other companies in the local area. It's that type of story has been pretty fundamental historically.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, John, you now work with two of the great life science venture firms, Atlas here in the East and Arch based in the West.
Yeah.
Or maybe in Chicago. How have they changed? I mean, they are always forming companies themselves, but how are they interacting with this university science to get things going? It must be different, you know, now from 10 years ago.
Well, I think it's more the same than different, Bob. I mean, there's still an incredible amount of the work that gets done is coming from academic research, or maybe more now than before. You know, we see sometimes a convergence of work that comes out of a company and academic research. For example, I'm doing an RNA therapeutics company called Orbital, which is based out of technology from Stanford on the academic side, and then Beam, a biotech company, on the industry side. And so it's a bit of a blend of how the technology is coming together to form this company. It might have in the past been only from an academic environment that you would bring, form a new company, but now we're seeing a little bit of, to Ruth's point, some of this blending between academia and industry happening, and that's impacting how companies are being formed as well.
Yeah, Ruth, I'm wondering, as someone who spent a lot of time in New York in recent years, but also a fair amount of time, here in Boston, is there a noticeable difference in the kinds of research that you see scientists doing here because of the biotech industry, or do you think it has some kind of influence in this town that it doesn't in other parts of the country?
I know from graduate students being very, very interested in this. And while I was at NYU, they started actually a real program sort of to make these connections. And of course, they had been incredibly successful with Jan Wilczek's discoveries. But it's not there, it's not in the surrounding. It's too expensive. There's a little bit, right? There's Alexandria, there's a few, but they're just really startup and so the science is really going on in New Jersey. So while the trainees are very interested, it's not the same kind of atmosphere because you just don't run into the people. And I would say it is a different spirit. On the other hand, New Yorkers would say, oh, when I come to Boston, all my colleagues are talking about is the next company they're founding, and I'm just interested in the science. So you may hear that too, right? So I think it depends, but it's clear, you can't have anything like this in Manhattan. And there were discussions of could we build something, but it's just so expensive. And so I think proximity is something, I mean, we talk about this all the time, proximity of, who is your neighbor in your lab is important. So ideas do come. Even, here we are on Zoom, there is still, I think, an important component of creativity comes from juxtaposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's sort of impossible to take the red line through Kendall Square and not overhear someone talking about their idea for a company, right? And I want to talk about this idea of proximity a little bit more. Kendall Square is obviously a very, dense area. There's a lot happening there, and it's really started to overflow. I think into other parts of the city. I'm wondering what you all think about. I guess how crucial having that densely packed Kendall Square is. For these collisions and between academics and people in the biotech industry. Like, how crucial is that for Boston's biotech ecosystem?
I used to say that the Center of Biomedical Innovation is the legal seafoods by the Whitehead Institute and MIT, just back there, and I mean it in the sense that in the old days, you'd go there to grab a lunch or a drink after work, and invariably you'd run into some academic colleague, collaborator, founder, some venture capitalist or two, some entrepreneur, VP, director, CEO, whatever the case might be from a company, invariably. And new ideas get started. New things happen when the spontaneous engagement of ideas come together in a spark. And, it really is a critical part of Kendall Square and what's made it so unbelievable. And it goes beyond Kendall Square because, obviously it's a broader community now, but of course it has started really in the square.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking a lot about the growth of biotech, and and as I mentioned, right, walking through Kendall Square, or even Fenway or the Seaport, you can see the physical growth of biotech. But at the same time, I think by many financial measures, 2022 was a very rough year for the industry. Obviously, some companies are doing very well and others are not. A lot of biotech leaders have recently told me they expect this year to be tough as well. There could be a lot of downsizing, layoffs, closing of companies. And I guess, I just, pose the question, has biotech grown too big too fast? And, is there a larger risk to the industry, or is this just a rough patch that it's going to get through?
You're the man, John.
All right, I'll do it. I mean, I think this is just a rough patch, Ryan, and we've seen it before. Alnylam got started in 2002 after the tech bubble burst, and nobody thought you'd ever be able to finance and capitalize a science-based company anymore. Everybody thought you'd have to find some fallen late-stage asset from a pharma company and capitalize a single asset company. So we've been there before. We were there in 2009 during the Great Recession, and it happens in cycles. And this is a deep cycle. There's no doubt. This is a deep period. And there may be a larger number of companies that went public ahead of this cycle than we've seen in the past, which might make it seem a little bit more painful, and also make the capital a little bit more scarce across the larger number of companies. But there's no doubt that this is just a typical cycle that we've seen in the past. And explosion of biomedical innovation and science that's coming out of, and Ruth can talk about it, coming out of our laboratory discoveries and the tools to translate these discoveries faster into medicines is just unmatched. And we're just at the beginnings of where this is all going to go.
But I think one thing that is going to change is that there are a lot of positions where people do not have to come in. You know, so there's the laboratory research, and then there are all the administrative staff, computational, and that sort of has a good and a bad. You know, it's not so good because those people are not bumping into each other, but on the other hand, you can get talent from the entire world. And that, of course, also has implications to the space. And so I think that is a new point where you look at your building and you say, do we really need all that space, or how do we make the space actually really work with that? That is new, and that's I would say that's actually something really good that the pandemic, because we all talked about it, but we weren't doing it, and then we were forced to it, and we realized people at home were just as productive. We do know what's missing when you don't meet each other. And so we're just kind of, I think we completely revolutionized, I think, after these 2 years, with total throw over of how we did work. And I think this will have a very rapid consequences. And that has consequences now in space, you know, and there's open space in Kendall Square because people just didn't come back. And commuting in Boston is terrible. We haven't mentioned that yet.
You know, maybe jumping on this, these topics of remote work, commuting, maybe even throwing housing crisis in there as well. Wondering if you could all comment on what you see as some of the potential threats to Boston remaining an epicenter for biotech.
Well, I think remote work is the biggest threat. I think, I think there are, and I agree with Ruth, there are many benefits of it. Of course, the cost to creativity and innovation, I think, is yet to be really measured. And for building some of these companies, culture is also a really critical factor. And I think it's very hard to really build strong cultures in a virtual or remote way. I know there's a lot of companies that are innovating around this approach and trying to find a good way to do it going forward, but I do think it's quite challenging. And I think for the Boston ecosystem, I think it really does pose a threat, because exactly as Ruth said, if you're able to now find talent around the world, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't have to be here, then that's a bad thing for here. And I think that's something which we'll see how it plays out. I'm a big proponent of getting back to work in person now, and believe that that's going to be an important part of keeping our vibrancy as a industry strong. And I think we can lose it if we all work from the ski slopes or the beach.
Please, Ruth.
No, go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
Well, I agree completely with what John said. And in fact, people said to me that one reason there was so much success, say, with vaccines and the collaboration that went on during the pandemic was that there was this base of trust among people all over the world because they had worked together and they knew each other, and they wondered if that the next time around, if they don't have those former close bonds, can they work as effectively and have that trust that's needed? So that was one thing. The other kind of challenge that I always look at, that just from walking through Kendall Square in recent years, there used to be such a mix of startups and startup spaces and so forth. And now it's just one giant corporation after the other. And that's true on the tech side and on the life science side. And that does take a little of the soul out of the place, I think. And I think you have to, it has to happen. It has a lot of good things, but I would point that out too.
So maybe to talk about these growing pains, the biotech industry is going through here. I mean, particularly in Kendall Square, we have a number of questions from our attendees about just the high cost of living near Kendall Square, and the high cost of lab space. And I'm wondering what you all think about whether Kendall Square has maybe gotten too big and too dense. How does the biotech industry or what can the biotech industry do to keep Kendall Square thriving and not just a super expensive place that only the most well-funded pharma companies or biotechs can afford to be in?
Well, I think we've had lots of discussions around this historically around the infrastructure, the need for better infrastructure in the Commonwealth to make it more affordable, to make the public transportation better so that people can come in easier without the hair-tearing commutes that many people have. And I think that's going to be really important to continue the efforts to facilitate being able to come into the Boston area. A lot of companies, of course, have moved into the sort of peripheral areas, which I think is totally fine. And many of these areas, Watertown, Waltham, et cetera, those are also becoming populated with biotechs and might be easier to get to for many people. So it doesn't all have to be in Kendall Square. I think I think we benefit by having a broader ecosystem within the 128 and 495 Beltway as well. And we also have some great universities out west, like UMass, for example, that has also been a place to foster some biotechnology as well. But infrastructure is really going to be key, no doubt about it.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, we would be great, right? There should be better transportation in Boston. I mean, it's very clear, right? And faster. And why aren't we, the first to have much faster transportation? Because it is a problem when people from, 19 miles away, it takes them an hour and a half to get to work. That is just not right. But then the other part that I think, so if it spreads out more, we really need to think that Kendall Square is maybe not the place where by accident you meet, but we need to make more of an effort. So really bringing people together, having more events now that also this is kind of coming out of our homes and really kind of connecting in that way. So I think that is a really, really important part. And from the academic side, so far our postdocs and students haven't been on strike like what we've seen in California. And I do think we need to work and recognize that postdocs and graduate students, they are, they're high-level employees, and we've been treating them not like that. And I think that is really, really important. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that, the academic, because we need to make academic science as attractive as biotech, because one doesn't work without the other. One other thing I do feel like we don't have, Zuckerbergs in Boston. And obviously that brings that has brought the scientific community together, even despite the fact they're very far away, like Berkeley and Stanford and UCSF, and we don't have something like that. And that's also kind of interesting. So for example, in New York, there's the New York Structural Biology Center, which provided cryo-EM support. And so that allowed anybody to do structural biology, or any structural biologist, with these really, really expensive instruments, right? And that is sort of something like where the institutions in Boston are coming together and doing something like that. That's not something actually that I noticed now coming back, that those were sort of some aspects which, if we want to be, want to stay and be the best, that may be something to consider.
Yeah, you've hit on another topic that's popped up in several questions, which is the strengths and weaknesses between the San Francisco Bay Area and Boston in terms of what it can offer for life science research and biotech. Any of you, but maybe John or Bob in particular, is there anything else you would add on sort of the relative pros and cons of being in Boston for biotech as opposed to out in California.
Bob, you want to start?
Well, I mean, a lot of it's been touched upon, and the density, not just of with the proximity to like great educational institutions, the venture capitalists. There's the management school expertise and the management expertise that's here. There's the patients that we've already mentioned. There's the medical stuff, and there's all these this incredible concentration of people that are really important but don't get the headlines. Like they know how to write grants, or they know how to make filings for the FDA, and they know how to run trials and all these kinds of things that are just tight. And so these are tremendous assets that no place in the world really has that concentration. So that's one thing, I really stress.
I would add another really, really important difference, and there's been, an appropriate concern about this as well. But Bob reminded us earlier that in 2002, Novartis put a stake in the ground by having its global headquarters for research come here. And I remember meeting with Mark Fishman in 2002. Actually, it was early 2003, and Mark was the first leader of NIBR, Novartis Institute for Research. And I had just been starting Alnylam, and so we met with each other, and we were basically two startup CEOs meeting with each other. Of course, one with a lot more cash and resources than the other. But it was an exciting time. But now we see this incredible number of major pharmaceutical companies that have a major presence within Boston and typically within Kendall Square. Takeda is the largest employer in the life sciences. They acquired Shire. I happen to be on the board of Takeda, and they're very proud to be part of the ecosystem. They acquired Millennium in 2008 as well. And you've got, Pfizer has a large presence, AstraZeneca, every major pharma company has a presence here as well. You don't see that on the West Coast. You don't see that in the Bay Area. And the reason for it is actually pretty simple. These major pharma companies are either located, their corporate headquarters are oftentimes in New Jersey. So it's a lot easier to get, here to Boston. We also have a better football team. And they're oftentimes also located in Europe. And it's a lot easier to get to the East Coast than the West Coast. So that has been a big advantage of keeping the life sciences sector very, very strong in the Boston area relative to the Bay Area.
Yeah, really good point.
We have a number of, questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, I think is certainly an area that many have pointed out biotech has not done a great job in, and certainly could be doing a lot better of a job. I'm wondering, what are the current, hurdles today that could be removed to do better in that area?
Ruth, you want to start, or Bob?
Yeah, maybe I can start with, I think it's always comes sort of in a way from the top, the willingness to say, we want to hire more diverse, we should look broader, and we should find ways of how to do that. But I think people need to see themselves, trainees need to see professors who are diverse to say, like, I could be that, right? And the same for the biotechs. But I think initially one really has to make an effort and to say, so when we now search for faculty, we really make an effort, and that's in every university, obviously. And there are so I think that's what has to happen. I mean, in biotech, while in academic science, women are doing better. In biotech, that's still a big problem. And there is some, and again, which is also really nice, coming out of MIT with Nancy Hopkins, Susan Hochfeld, and Sangeeta Bhatia, where there's this real, kind of getting women to know what it takes and really making that possible, which I think is a great initiative, and that is, that's what has to be done, and then there has to be a willingness, and that's a first step. But obviously, we have to go way beyond, like, welcoming women into biotech.
Mhm.
I think it's wonderful to see two of the largest and most successful biotech companies now in Massachusetts, Alnylam and Vertex, led by women leaders, both diverse as well. And but I think Ruth's right. It takes a real commitment from the CEO and the board and others to want to have and embrace diversity as part of how they think about, frankly, achieving better business outcomes and better business results. It's not a nice to have. I think it's a differentiator. And so companies that strive openly to bring diversity into the boardroom, to bring diversity into their leadership teams, to bring diversity into their overall top leadership, that's going to be a driver of ultimate business success. And people have to embrace that or lose that benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I echo those things. I've been really proud to have been a member of that Future Founders Initiative that Susan Hochfield, Sangeeta, and Nancy Hopkins started, that Ruth talked about, since its inception. And that was a very deliberate effort to get women faculty more familiar with business. It included getting permission to go do paid leaves at venture firms to learn about the business, to learn about serving on scientific advisory boards, and all these things that are really necessary so you can envision your own success and get the knowledge you need. At Xconomy, we did dinners on this all over the country, and this is, of course, a universal problem. But it's not just picking people or giving fellowships, and you have to have, in the companies, you have to have plans and procedures all up and down the board. So somebody has to get mid-management experience before they can be a CEO. And how do you make sure that those pathways are at your company at every level so that people can succeed when they get to bigger roles? So all these things are very, very hard to, but they're, amazing people working on them.
And we have a number of different questions about, people asking, for advice about getting into the biotech industry, about, how grad students and postdocs should be thinking about translating their research into a biotech company. Even a question on, how can business students be preparing, to enter the biotech world. So I sort of throw all of that at you, sort of maybe under the umbrella of, what training programs or can we implement in Boston, or how should we be teaching students at our universities here to prepare them for the biotech industry?
Ruth, maybe you want to start.
Preparing. I still think first we need a really good education, and really make sure that people are very creative, and that they because I think that is the whole point about startups, right? It's like trying an idea. And so I think that's the same as, in the research laboratory. And so I think supporting creativity and independent thinking among and really sort of, I always, big on empowering them to really find their ways. I think that's how we prepare, whether it's somebody going into academic science or going into biotech, right? But then the next steps is obviously, I think John and Bob should comment more on that sort of what's a good path. I mean, at most universities now, certainly at MIT, there are a lot of resources for young people to find out, to make connections, but then there's also the reality, and maybe you can talk to that more.
Yeah, I get the question a lot, Ryan, and Ruth's right. It starts with an education. There's no doubt about that. You have to get the best, and thankfully, there's a lot of that around here. There's you couldn't find a better location for that by all accounts. Whether you're getting a undergraduate degree or graduate degree or MD or MBA, there's no shortage of that in the local community. But when people say, or young people ask me about coming into the industry, I always encourage them to go to one of the biotechs, one of the more established biotechs or smaller pharmas, and learn about drug discovery, drug development, drug commercialization, learn that process. And there's often this temptation to go in and start up a new company at the get-go and be a founder and, be really successful all of a sudden and make a lot of money, et cetera. That's just not the way it works. I mean, you really need to learn. And you need to go learn from companies that have done it, that have brought important medicines to the market to help patients, and that's something which I really do encourage young people when they ask me the question to do that. 3-5 year, think of it as a postdoc, think of it as a sabbatical, think about it as a learning experience before you jump into the venture world or the founder world or whatever the case might be.
Let me talk about a different aspect of this issue of preparing for jobs. And this comes up under the challenges to Kendall Square and the ecosystem. Especially in Kendall Square, you have this amazing dense concentration, a lot of gigantic buildings, and then right next to that is East Cambridge, and their buildings have gone up and their views have gotten worse and worse, and they have no real pathway to work. And yet there's got to be many jobs in biotech and pharma that you don't have to have a PhD or even necessarily a college education, but some training. And how does Kendall Square bridge that gap? I mean, a lot of people are working on this problem, but getting jobs for the whole community, not just for the highly educated community.
Yeah. Actually, something I do want to hit on briefly is, oftentimes, and I'm very guilty of this as well, when I think of biotech jobs, I think of science and research and lab work, but there's a lot that goes into making a drug and building a biotech company. I'm wondering if there's just, anything that any of you think the industry could be doing better to bring more diverse people from more diverse backgrounds into this sector, to fill those positions that aren't necessarily, a lab bench kind of job.
Well, I think there could be more training programs, even vocational schools that develop to really train people on biotechnology, whether it's for doing work in a lab or doing work in a manufacturing facility or doing work in other aspects of the business. But there really is, I think, an opportunity of doing that. Some of the universities do it, but I think what we're talking about here is really, not a university path. And I would argue that just like there are vocational schools for many jobs out there, there could be an opportunity for vocational schools that are really committed to training biotech workers. And that would be a wonderful way to bring more people without a graduate degree or undergrad degree into the industry.
That's really good. I'm not an expert in what, but there are pockets of vocational training programs at community colleges and things like that. My sense is they're very much pockets, and they're not and they're not really integrated, and they're not like, boy, I would love to see whether it's a company or a wealthy individual that could really stand up what John was talking about, a dedicated, life science vocational institution, that would be potentially very interesting.
Bob, let's do it together. Ruth can help us. She'll bring the faculty.
No,
and-
because because I was just thinking, at Whitehead, we have all these programs, right? We have a high school teacher program, middle school students learning about biology. So getting this whole STEM, excitement, but that's kind of, and it's of course very, very small, but it's everybody is trying to put their part, but it's really important to get people excited, to get young people excited about science, but then making also possible that they see all the possibilities. I wanted to briefly talk about, one of the questions were like, how do you keep the people in science or in biotech and advance and all that? And obviously MIT and Harvard now have women presidents, which is absolutely wonderful. But also it is the numbers. I really believe it's the numbers at the end, right? If you have a colleague who looks like you, you're going to feel like you belong there. And, and the more, so we just have to work on it. It's really it's obviously climate, but climate change is also with the diversity. And so it is really the numbers. And so I think that is how do you keep also, so if people see now all of a sudden, there is much more diversity in the top level of institutions. I think it's going to, it can change. And so I really believe in that. And I really, think this has become much more of an emphasis, not just in academia, but also in the biotech sector.
We have, a number of questions about manufacturing, actually, and this is something that's come up on my radar quite a bit over the past year. I admit that manufacturing is not the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Massachusetts and biotech. There are certainly some here. The COVID vaccine was made here, right? I'm wondering what you all thinking. Is this something that that Massachusetts could be doing better on? Like, should we try to become a biomanufacturing hub? Can we compete? Are there places to house workers that are affordable? Is there land that's affordable to build those facilities? And maybe to to include Ruth in this question, are there things that academic scientists can be doing to improve biomanufacturing? I think it's often sort of considered something that the industry tackles and that the academic scientists typically stay out of. But maybe is that something that should change here?
Well, on the manufacturing side, I'm a big believer in the opportunity for more manufacturing opportunities and facilities in Massachusetts. We built all of our manufacturing facilities in Massachusetts. We looked at other locations as well, because you have to do that from a business standpoint, but we decided that we could do the best here in Massachusetts. So we have a facility in Norton, down by Foxborough. We have another facility in Cambridge, where we do manufacturing as well. And I think there could be an incredible competitiveness of, the Bay State in that regard. I mean, Fort Devens areas where BMS built up a significant amount of biologics manufacturing. Other companies, you mentioned the Moderna vaccine was manufactured in Massachusetts. So I think there's an opportunity there. We can get help, I think, from local towns and governments to make sure that we keep our companies' manufacturing plans here in the Bay State. I think that could be an opportunity for making it a little bit easier. We happened to get some support in that regard, which was crucial at the end of the day. But it's something which I'd like to see more of in the Bay State for sure. But on the education side, Ruth, you should comment.
I don't know, what more than, what I already said, that, you have to talk, you have to teach people in many different ways. I mean, there's also many different universities, at types of universities in Boston, some who are much more focused, like the BU programs, right, which are much more focused on really training specific disciplines to help people find actually employment in probably manufacturing more. And so I think that's also, I mean, the ecosystem is a lot bigger than we were just talking MIT, Harvard. We should really say there's lots and lots of possibilities, and also lots of different models of education. And so that's, I think that's important. But Massachusetts it's not just Boston, right? Massachusetts is a big country, so or a big state. So I think there should be enough place to really push that, and that doesn't have to be all in Kendall Square.
No.
There's one question I'm going to adapt here about, whether you think maybe people here in the industry should know more about the history of Kendall Square, or whether we need to do more work on the
read Bob's book.
So everyone can read Bob's book. Bob, what do you think about that? Was that, when you were working on that, was that a subject that had been broached before, or were you sort of covering completely new ground when you did that?
What do you mean reached before?
I was I guess writing a book about the history of Kendall Square. How hard was that? Was it was that something that someone had ever really tackled before?
Nobody had tackled that as a entire history. There are pieces of it, like the Route 128 ecosystem history, or Polaroids history, so things like that, but nobody tried to do it all together. That's a tough challenge. It takes a while, and you can only go so deep into all these really important things. So I had a great time writing it. I learned a lot. It's always that balance with history. We all want to know some of it, but we can't really master these whole things. I hope I can help in some way, though.
Yeah. Do you think that there is maybe something to be learned, from that history, that maybe some of the, solutions to some of the problems we've been talking about today could be gleaned by a better understanding of that history?
I don't know about solutions to problems. I mean, but the big lesson that comes through to me, and I think it's just something for us all to be aware of, is that nothing lasts forever. No matter how big and powerful and all domineering it seems, it's not going to last usually more than half a century.
Yeah.
And so to me, that means that we look at the biotech ecosystem. Of course, we're going to have biotechnology and life science and people's health and disease to tackle, but the form, I just don't think the current form of biotech is likely to last many more decades. That there are going to be new pressures on. Maybe you don't need a lab anymore because you can do everything digitally. You can program every single possible drug combination on your computer, and those kind of things have come up. That could make an impact on the space issue, and you just have to have this ecosystem that's constantly regurgitating and evolving. And that's one thing I think that the reason there has been innovation for over 200 years of all types of innovation is this density of different disciplines too, because it could be the computer scientist or the engineer or the artist who has a new take on how to approach this drug problem or the healthcare problem that makes Kendall Square or the region, Boston, Massachusetts, get into the next evolution and stay on top. Anyway, that's one big lesson that jumps out at me.
Yeah. We only have about another minute or so here. We have a lot of great questions that I was hoping to get to, but unfortunately we're out of time. I guess just to close, can I get a few words or a few sentences from each of you on your outlook for biotech, either in 2023 or into the rest of the decade? Maybe I'll start with you, John.
Well, I am very, very excited about the future and positive about the future. I mean, again, the remarkable pace of biomedical discovery coming out of largely academic research, but also companies and and how that will shape and frame, the treatments and futures and frontiers of medicine going forward. I mean, we are at the cusp of major breakthroughs across so many different diseases, and these are going to get solved over time with remarkable new medicines, and that's why I'm incredibly enthusiastic about where this industry is going.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm really positive about what's happening, because I also feel like it was in Boston where one of the COVID vaccines was made, right? That is a big proof to many people how important and how quick we scientists can act, right? So that's great, because it's sort of like a moon landing, right? I think this is probably more important than moon landing for the population, and so taking advantage of this really, in a way, for many people, very positive attitude towards research and what research can do, and but now the challenge is sort of to make something special out of that. I think we have an opportunity right now, and so now we have to sort of think even more about the culture, how we're connecting the culture. A lot of the things we talked about, how to connect people even when they're not bumping into each other. So to keep the creativity and to really show that this sector is the sector of the future, and that is so important, right? That this is where students want to go into biology to become entrepreneurs in the biotech sector, right? So this is really important, and we actually didn't talk about the influence of artificial intelligence, right? And connecting that with this ecosystem, so to be even more effective, productive, and so I think there's I'm very enthusiastic, and I always like challenges, because they kind of can only make it better, hopefully. And so I think we're at a really interesting point now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge optimist over the long term. Like everybody else, I'm worried about things in our world. But if you have faith in innovation and creativity, there's just no place like Massachusetts that's putting this all together, not just for new apps and stuff, but for the biggest challenges the world faces. So I'm pretty excited for the long run. Amazing people.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know I learned a lot. We are over time here. So thank you everyone who logged in. This will be recorded and available to watch later. And now we're going to close with a quick message from our sponsor.
Thank you to Ryan and all of today's panelists for such an engaging discussion on Boston's biotech ecosystem and where our industry is headed overall. I'm looking forward to what the future holds for all of our peers here in Boston, how we can continue to work together to bring more innovative thinking to the region, and how the greater Boston area can continue to fuel innovations around the world. It's such an exciting time to be part of biotech. So let's keep pushing to think creatively, be collaborative, and deliver much needed solutions for as many patients as possible. Thank you for joining us, and we invite you to keep an eye out for more on the Boston Globe's Health and Biotech Week.